The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and education. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr. Joining us on today's program is Byron Lewis, who's chairman of Uniworld Incorporated, one of the largest black advertising agencies in the country. Glad to have you with us today, Byron.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
I know you a long time, and I know the struggles that you've gone through to make Uniworld such an outstanding organization. So could you tell us how you got started, what motivated you, what your objectives were, and whether you think you have attained them? Given that you were on the cover of Fortune magazine, I think you've attained them, but let's hear about that.
Well, first, I wasn't on the cover.
Yeah.
I was inside with the rest of the elder statespeople.
Yeah, the buffaloes, they call them.
The graybeards. Actually, I got into this business by accident because I was a journalism major. I went to Long Island University here in New York City during the late 1950s. And at that particular time, there were no black people working anywhere in any communication business, mainstream communication business. And there were certainly no black people, other than Carl Rowan, working in any mainstream metropolitan daily, which is where I thought my career would take me. And after going in the Army, I was drafted. You remember those days, Dr. Brown, when people were drafted. I came out somewhere around 23, 22 years old with actually no future. And I realized that if I were going to work in this industry that I prepared myself for, I was going to have to do a lot of legwork. But there were really no places where you could get started. There's no entry level. So I really turned to the African American community. And my first job after I got started was on 125th Street. By then, I was almost 30 years old. I had acquired a number of graduate credits in business, in journalism at New York University, but I was not working in the industry. As a matter of fact, I had been a social worker. I worked for the welfare department here in New York City and became increasingly frustrated. And someone gave me a chance to work for a new newspaper, a new business venture called the Citizen Call. And a mutual friend of ours started that newspaper, John Patterson. And it was really dedicated to talking to the emerging Negro at that time, but it was underfinanced, and there really was no recognition of the black market. But it was a marvelous venture. I owe a lot to John, because I was really exposed to a lot of people who I admired who were also trying to find their way into business on 125th Street. Many of those people I consider my role models. They don't know it, but I consider them my role models. But you were around then too. But I remember that Percy Sutton was just opening his law practice on 125th Street. There were people like Richard Clark, who started his executive search company in the same neighborhood. Bruce Llewellyn was really just getting into the retail side. He owned a liquor store uptown. And then there were the politicians, and there were the civil rights leaders who really opened the doors. And Adam Clayton Powell was there then, beginning the boycott on the stores on 125th Street, opening the doors for the first black salespeople in the liquor companies and the alcoholic beverage companies. Malcolm X was on 125th Street, and you would see these people every day. And you would see people who were trying to do things, even though the industries were closed. And it became easy for me, since I really had no grounding in the business, to see other people striving, to be around people who were doing the same thing you were trying to do, and it was inspiring. And what happened simply was that I ended up working for the black that newspaper. That newspaper folded. Then there was a magazine we tried to start uptown called The Urbanite, with many of the editorial people and advertising people from that newspaper. And then that folded because we didn't know anything about the advertising business, and there was no recognition of the African American market. And then I spent another 5 to 10 years just doing a lot of freelance things, a lot of projects, a lot of ventures, which today I guess you'd call small business entrepreneurship. Very little of what I attempted to do with other people worked, but I got a lot of experience. And actually, Roscoe, I became a salesman. I found that in order to get into industry, there was no open door. So I had become used to ventures. And these ventures were all involved with the black experience, with other black people. And I began looking for things that hadn't been done. And in that way, one day, someone offered me a job on a magazine. That was called Tuesday Magazine. And it was designed to reach African Americans on a national basis. It was an insert, and it talked about different aspects of the black experience, but it was carried inside of mainstream dailies. And in that way, I called on all the companies who were at that time advertising to black people and to agencies, and I was somewhat successful. But really, in the long run, the problem was there just weren't enough ads. And so they used to say, well, gee, you know, we don't have any black people working in our advertising agencies. We don't have any black people working in the company. Now, if you had an advertising agency, I had no idea that I would ever have one. To me, it was just a good excuse to say no. But by that time, I was in my late 30s, and suddenly the doors opened because of the activities of the civil rights agencies, people like yourself, who pressured society, pressured the federal agencies to open these doors. Affirmative action opened the doors to the advertising industry. And suddenly there were black people working in agencies that were not there before. There were black people working in companies. There were black people in marketing. And there was the basis, a need for an advertising agency. Now, I never worked in an advertising agency, but because there were other people, I was able to raise some money. I had a partner at that time, a man named Manny Lopez, and we started out in blind faith. And fundamentally, it was sort of on-the-job learning. And I really didn't feel that I had anything to lose because there weren't too many people who had much more experience than I did. And also, it was because there was a receptive social climate. And it was okay to make mistakes. It was okay to try. And I've always felt fortunate that I was around people who were trying to do the same thing at the same time I was. And so it wasn't a matter of failure because, you know, what was there to lose? So the other thing that really happened was somewhere around the early 1970s, another marvelous thing happened. There were magazines that were being born, Essence, Black Enterprise, the National Black Network, which was the national radio network. Suddenly there were a number of black media entities beginning, and then there was a place to advertise. And I think one of the real breakthroughs happened, maybe about the same time, something called inner city broadcasting, because the creation of the music format that WBLS, the FM outlet for inner city, pioneered, really opened the door to the black radio music phenomena. And suddenly we had radio stations programming black music to black people all over the country. So in addition to the magazines, Black Enterprise and Essence and Ebony, you suddenly had black radio stations reaching black people. And I was lucky to be around when all of that was happening. And lucky to be around when a lot of other talented black people were able to get into this industry and create a business, which I feel glad to be a part of.
Of course, as you say, you were lucky. It reminds me of the expression that luck is the residue of hard work. And clearly, what you just described is a long trail of hard work and ambition and goal. And as we sit in the 90s, going into the 21st century, I'm just wondering what kind of lessons from your experience, come to black youth, black people graduating from college? You talked about 20-some years of developing this, and yet I meet young people, young African Americans, who are disappointed if they don't have a major executive job 3 years after they get out of college.
Well, the problem is, for one thing, that they have a chance to do something that we didn't have. They have networking opportunities. They really can be exposed to people who have workaday experience in these industries that they want to be in. Secondly, there's nothing better than a good foundation educationally. The opportunities now are even more enhanced, I'd say, because of technology. You really have to have a solid technological background called a computer. That has changed the world, certainly changed communication. Secondly, there are any number of people who are in the industries many of these young people want to be in. But I think there's a word that's fallen into disuse. It's called work, hard work. Yeah, there are some expectations young people have, sort of wanting to start at the top, because they see so much promotion of successful people, African Americans, in these industries. But if I were to give any advice, it's really to go into an industry that you really are in love with, infatuated with, is probably a better idea.
See, everybody's infatuated with advertising, the media, and radio, so there are only so many opportunities.
They're not in love with it, though. You know, it's hard love. It's tough love, this kind of business. But I think you must go into areas you're good at. And then, no matter how hard it is, it's easy. That's the first thing. Secondly, since people can get jobs today, and they can, get a
if
work
they have
history.
the education and
That's
the skills.
Right. That's right. And it's something they really want to do. Get a job within that industry, so that you don't go into an industry, as I did, without any training, without any knowledge. And then I think you will have the opportunity to be around people who are doing things the right way. And secondly, you get experience. And thirdly, you really begin to make contacts. And fourthly, if you're very smart, you begin to see areas in that industry you're interested in where there's an opportunity. Now, this whole idea of opportunity, to me, in my case, had to do with ethnicity. See, the African American consumer market grew tremendously during the time I was trying to find a way into business. And where 25, 30 years ago, no one was interested in the black consumer market, now it's a fact of life. So I consider myself fortunate. I guess that's a different word than lucky. But fortunate that the black consumer market has grown. For a lot of young people these days, they tend not to want to go into something that's ethnically focused, which I understand. But I still consider ethnicity, or diversity, as they call it now, a major growth opportunity, where there's still many business opportunities that are undeveloped because of the fact that we just haven't had people to have the opportunity. So there's a tendency for newly arrived wannabes, I guess is a good word, to skip over what you and I know has been the foundation of our black business. That is the black consumer and the Hispanic and the Asian consumer markets.
I think two things come out of what we're talking about. One is the civil rights movement, of how it raised the boats for all black people, so that they had the economic resource to buy some of these items, discretionary and otherwise.
To become a consumer market.
To become a consumer market. The other has to do with the recent attacks on affirmative action. And a classic example is in the University of California, a couple of their law schools, where at one time in the entering class they had 80-some students, now they have 2.
Right.
Because they're going on examinations and things that have some cultural impact. I think this is a wake-up call for African-American youth and African-American college graduates, that yes, the affirmative action gets you in the door, but you have to have something above whatever your color or ethnicity brings you. The other thing, from a political point of view, those of us who are successful have an obligation to keep the heat on the power of our country that easily would see us slip back. The gains that we made in the 70s and 80s are definitely receding. A few outstanding CEOs
Sure.
and outstanding people in the media, but for the masses, some of those gains are being challenged very, very rigorously. For example, government. You say you started as a social investigator, something I also did when I first came to New York. Public sector. Public sector employment is shrinking now. And as it shrinks, you see part of that middle class of African Americans comes out of that also shrinking, which then leads us to the question of how we can mobilize our capital to help support and develop new businesses. Access to capital probably is the most, that plus expertise, but probably more access to capital is one of the biggest challenges that African American businesses face. How do you think we might address this as a group of people, as African Americans?
I wish I could find an easy answer, because part and parcel of what you're saying is that when I was evolving, I knew that my future lay within the structure of the black community. And all of my business associations, social, evolved from that. And at that particular time, most of us lived within what I considered to be segregated communities, where you could perpetuate value systems like education. Growing up, you could see people in your neighborhood working hard, but who were going to be lawyers and doctors. Today, the success that's come about as a result of affirmative action has dispersed our communities. And we don't have, to me, the basis for capital accumulation or capital formation, which is a problem for the future. I would think that this becomes the role of the church, which I think has a tremendous need to refocus black people. I think that the importance of our social organizations, the NAACP, the Urban League, but I would say the NAACP because of its grassroots affiliation. And the third thing is that there's a tendency for us not to have the same leadership. That's a difficult word to say, but we're so dispersed that we need to come back together. Now, you and I were talking, the Black Caucus in Washington, D.C., maybe that needs to be refocused in the sense of really having the ability as an annual event to bring the business people, the professionals, the political people into one large congregation over a week's period, which is really what it's become. Maybe that ought to be the focus in the future of that organization's activities, because this ability to galvanize our economic resources is really part and parcel of the future.
But as you were talking, you remind me of something that's happening in South Africa with the ANC, the protest organization, whereas they now have gone into the mainstream in a multiracial society. All the ANC people are getting jobs and developing businesses in the private sector, and the gap between this economic and political elite and the masses is still there.
It's growing.
And one of the things
Yes.
we have, and it's true in Black America too, one of the things we have a substantial middle class, maybe 40%, but we also have a substantial lower class, maybe 25%. So one of the questions that comes about is how do we bridge this? We're all human beings, we all have different talents, we have a random curve of ability. And those of us who are successful like to say, well, look, if we did it, why can't they do it? Now, you and I both know why they can't do it: lack of opportunity, which then raises the question of our role, your role. For example, in the advertisements that you produce, you do a lot of things that show African Americans in a lot of different ways.
Right.
And you also do things that relate to causes that we're concerned about. I don't know how that plays in the business community, but I know it plays very well with me when I see it.
Well, you're quite accurate. Not only are we in that position, I think we have an obligation to do that. What we attempt to do in our commercials is to project a positive view of the black experience. And wherever possible, we want to show aspirational situations that are realistic, not pie in the sky. And just at this point, I'm mindful of some work we're doing for AT&T, where we actually show father and son, father and daughter businesses, because AT&T is interested in reaching small business units. And it's very good to be able to show people in the process of building businesses and doing things that are what I would consider to be entrepreneurial. We can do that up to a degree, but we have another opportunity. During the last 10 years, there's been a decade of what I call the new black filmmakers. And they're actually able to create visual representations of black life and experience. And because of their success, the Spike Lees, the Robert Townsends, the Warrington Hudlins, they've also been able to move over into television. I think this generation, for the first time, has the ability to create images that are desirable, given the constraints of commercialism. So since I'm in the communication business, yeah, I feel an obligation to do that where possible. And we are able to influence what people hear and what people see. And we do attempt to do that. But I'd rather go back to what we were talking about. I think it's the community formation that's the largest need. I don't know how it's possible, but it's very significant that people see real life people, not superstar athletes, not superstar entertainers, not public figures who bear no resemblance to the real opportunities that these young people face. Young people today have problems you and I never had. See, I never knew millionaires when I grew up. The average African American person living still within, let's say, the inner city areas can point out people in the neighborhood who are millionaires, playing basketball, playing football, boxers, and illegal activities.
But they don't find many business millionaires.
That's the problem. The problem is that our middle class, our upwardly mobile middle, has left our neighborhoods. And that, to me, is one of the biggest problems. I think one of the important things to do is really to develop small businesses. And you'll notice among the newly arrived, the immigrant populations, particularly from the Black Caribbean, people from Jamaica, Trinidad, Haiti, people have come in, they've opened stores, they've bought homes, they've fixed those homes up, they've built little businesses.
But doesn't some of this have to do with the psyche? Remember, many of the African Americans who've been here since 1619
right, that's right.
lived with the legacy of slavery for 250 years.
Right.
And people who've come from other places, not just African Americans, but Asians and Latino Americans, have had experiences where, at least in their country, they were able to run businesses.
They were in charge. That's right.
And of course, with any immigrant experience, the most aggressive are the ones who immigrate.
That's who comes here.
So one of the things that I think folks like yourself who deal with the media have a responsibility of helping to get that bridge between the masses and those who've been more successful, and particularly in terms of our institutions, our churches, our social institutions, our educational institutions.
I think that the other thing I would add about the immigrant populations, which is really changing the face of New York and other urban areas, is that they're not necessarily coming here from the educated classes. They are the work-oriented population who come here because they see an opportunity here. They see an opportunity that many of us who've been here a long time don't see. And that's the other difference, that despite all the problems that our society has, you can work here and you can accumulate wealth and capital. And I'm struck by the enterprise of the groups that come here. And I would only say, you don't necessarily have to be a college graduate. I think you should become as well educated as you can. But it's the ability to control your destiny. You and I work for the welfare department, but I have to tell you, the majority of the immigrants who come here do not get welfare.
That's right. One, they're not qualified
that's
in
right.
many instances,
You
but
know,
others, they don't want it.
They don't want it. The idea of working is such an important concept. I think we have to reestablish our value systems. People talk about conservatism and liberalism, and I can tell you, no one was more conservative than the black people that I grew up with. No one had anything. People had come here first generation from the South, worked 2 and 3 jobs, and you remember those days. To me, it's one of the value systems I wish we could perpetuate. And I think that would happen if we could help rebuild our community organizations. How to do that is another matter, but I think that that's the foundation for the future. It's small business, getting the idea of work, what would I say, reinvigorated. You don't have to do wonderful things and be in Fortune magazine. But it's more important to me to have a base that can support itself, because small business employs more people and employs people in the neighborhoods.
The one thing we haven't talked about, we don't have much time left today, is the role of politics. Because politics is power.
Absolutely.
Power brings about resources,
and
open
leverage.
doors,
And
leverage. In your earlier conversation, you were talking really about politics.
Yes.
Not just
right.
Politics by party, but the whole question of being active.
Well, you're absolutely right. This whole idea of affirmative action was really the forerunner to politics, because it was a civil rights organization, the combined power, the persuasive power, the leveraging of moral attitudes that opened the doors of affirmative action. But now, if people would vote, they now have a tool that, very candidly, we haven't used very well.
And as we come to the close of the program, I want to say that your industry can do a lot to encourage people to vote.
I agree.
Okay,
I agree.
I want to thank you, Byron Lewis, for being with us today on African American Legends, and you really helped us to understand both the role of business and the role of advocacy in improving conditions for African Americans.